Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. Hope you went and got some fish beforehand or did some praying too with the stations before coming on over. We're on our 6th session of 8. And tonight we're moving from the first 5 really focused on the life of the church. And now we're going to move to the relationship of the church to those outside the church. So especially in our modern world that we have today. So that's going to be kind of the document we talk about. But in order to prepare for that, we're going to start out with our Lectio Divina again, calling forth the Holy Spirit, reading through the Scriptures, then listening to what God is speaking to us, and finishing with some praise. So we're using the Gospel from this coming Sunday, which is a long one. So let's first pray. Come, Holy Spirit, fill our hearts and minds for us to be ready to hear and heed your word, so that we, during this Lenten season, may continually be converted and grow in deeper relationship with you. Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus. But the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them Jesus addressed this parable. A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, "Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me." So the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. And he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. Coming to his senses, he thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat? But here am I, dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and shall say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers.' So he got up and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But his father ordered his servants, 'Quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fatted calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life again. He was lost and has been found.' Then the celebration began. Now the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, 'Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf, because he has him back safe and sound.' He became angry, and when he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, 'Look, all these years I served you, and not once did I disobey your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughter the fatted calf.' He said to him, 'My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.'" The Gospel of the Lord. So I spend a few moments thinking about what has struck us in this passage, what God may be attempting to say to us. comes to my mind is how apt this passage is for tonight's topic. The two brothers could represent those that are in the church and those outside the church, and this dialogue between them is that we want to rejoice in the coming back of all people, that all will learn from the truths that the church has, the true meaning of who they are as being created in God's image and likeness. So now we spend a few moments responding to what God has spoken to us through this passage. Now, just spend a moment listening, letting God speak when He wants to. So we'll finish our short time of prayer with the Sunday Psalm. Taste and see the goodness of the Lord. Taste and see the goodness of the Lord. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall ever be in my mouth. Let my soul glory in the Lord. The lowly will hear me and be glad.
Taste and see the goodness of the Lord.
Glorify the Lord with me. Let us together extol his name. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and delivered me from all my fears.
Taste and see the goodness of the Lord.
Look to him that you may be radiant with joy, and your faces may not blush with shame. When the poor one called out, the Lord heard, and from all his distress he saved him.
Taste and see the goodness of the Lord.
All right, that's a great juxtaposition of those two. Of coming back, the prodigal son being called back, and this great song of happiness, the goodness that God has. And the document that we're going to go through tonight, Gaudium et Spes, really is in that context. And we'll come to that in a moment. First we're going to review those principles. For those who have been coming, we'll be becoming quite familiar with them. So the principles, of course, based upon things that now Emeritus, Pope Benedict, said before and then during his time as Pope, of the two different ways of interpreting the Council, through the hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture versus the hermeneutic of reform. So seeing the Council as bringing something new, and actually we should go beyond what the Council documents actually say, would be the hermeneutic of discontinuity, which is the one that we should not be following, but rather the hermeneutic of reform in continuity. So reading the documents within the long history of the Church and seeing that the desire was not that the Church teaches something new, but it's expressing what she teaches in a new way because she's in a new time and desires that everyone be able to understand what she's saying, which is a big part of what tonight's document is going to be all about. So, summary of the principles. If we speak of a Spirit of Vatican II, it's in the documents themselves, not in other innovations that may have come afterwards or that you don't find there. The documents are teachings of the magisterium because they were, even though there was a combination of human and divine elements, so it's very incarnational, produced with the work of the Holy Spirit. So we read them in continuity with all previous teachings, and in the realms of faith and morals, it teaches infallibly and therefore requires our religious consent to them. So the doctrines don't change, but the presentation can. And through this whole time, we also recognize that perhaps the things that are being looked for in the documents have not yet been realized in the world. And so that's the tension of the already, but not yet of the kingdom. The kingdom, the church, is here present in the world, but things have not yet all been ordered to Christ. So tonight's document is Gaudium et Spes, which is the church in the modern world. So Gaudium et Spes is Latin for joy and hope. And that's actually that's the first words of the document. says, "The joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ." So at the very beginning of the document, the church is expressing a kind of connectedness with the whole world. We're just not in the world apart from everybody else, but we recognize our connection with everyone. And so since we've spent this long period of time understanding our own identity in the church, who we are, now that we know who we are, we're going to look at it and say, okay, now how do we speak to those who are not in the church? So this is actually, Gaudium et Spes is actually the longest document of the council. It was the last one that they promulgated, but it's also the longest. So right away when I was going in, don't worry, you're all, oh no, now Father's going to go until like midnight tonight. Don't worry, knowing that how long it actually was, I was like, okay, I have to do a lot of summarizing. So this, we'll see, but it might turn out shorter than the other ones, maybe. That's about how much conversation we have too. If you're interested in lots of detail about this document, because it really is a rich document, so there's a lot of details in it that I can't talk about tonight. But if you're interested in more, the emails that go out from the website, there's a series of presentations that a priest from Wichita gave, Father Jared Elias, and he gave 6 talks on Gaudium et Spes alone, each an hour long. So he goes into it in great detail. So we're not going to spend 6 hours on Gaudium et Spes tonight. So this is an outline of the document, and lucky for you, it divides great into 2 parts, so we get to take a break. It's built in. So the part 1 is more kind of, it's called a pastoral constitution, because a lot of it is taking the teachings of the church and applying it to current issues that are important. Of course, important at the time of the council, and a lot of them are still just as important, if not more, now today. So the whole first part is going to be more doctrinal. So discussing what is the dignity of the human person, talking about this kind of the social, connected in the community, how we act in the world, and then specifically the role the church has in the modern world today. And then these principles are going to be applied in part 2 in the specific areas of marriage and the family, culture, economics, political life, and peace, peace and dealing with the issue of war as well. So that's the overview of what Gaudium et Spes is. So there's a lot of details that come out under those headings. So we'll be able to go into it very generally, but some of the details that it mentions we won't be able to go into. So the document begins with an introduction, and it gives kind of a description of what the world was like at the time of the council. And so it kind of goes on for a little while, and I didn't go into all those ideas. But the main point is that the church looks at what it sees in the culture. It looks at the signs of the times and attempts to understand them, what's going on, in light of the gospel. So it does that throughout its entire history, and so it's no different today. That's the way we ought to all live as Christians too, of understanding the things that are going on around us in the light of the gospel and Christ's word. So some of the things that it said it noticed at the time about traditional values being put into question. Well, that probably still applies today. The abandoning of religious practice, especially due to scientific process and what they called a new humanism. Basically, humanism is a type of like philosophy or way of looking at the world that emphasizes human beings and their role, but it kind of, some versions of it separate them from God. So it goes along with this. That's why there's an abandoning of religious practice, that it's based on what the human person can do kind of on their own, rather than the need for God. And because of many of the things that you see in the world, the Council Fathers point out that there's this imbalance that occurs in society, mainly due because there's an imbalance in the human heart. There's this seeking, there's this, we're not finding what it is that we long for. in the human heart. So that's kind of the context of the time of the council in a very broad sense, and that's really, it still is that way today in many senses. So it continues that recognizing the various communities that exist, that all have a part in perfecting the individuals that take part of the community. So political, social, economic orders are there to serve man and to help us to grow in greater dignity. And that will be fleshed out in several sections of this document. Certain examples that it brings out of ways in which this has occurred. So providing material goods for developing nations, greater freedom for citizens in many places that didn't have that kind of freedom, the ability to participate in political and cultural life, greater equality for women. So there's some examples that it mentioned of these, of communities assisting in perfecting human dignity. Human dignity is going to be an important concept. We'll find out, what does the church mean by human dignity? Because the world doesn't always mean the same thing that we mean when we're talking about the dignity, what the basis of our dignity is as human beings. So the first section then, it does go into the dignity of the human person. And a lot of this talk, to help me to summarize it, I use this book here, which is Vatican II, Renewal Within Tradition. So it's what it does is it goes through the documents and it puts them kind of in context and reads them in light of the tradition that's gone before, and really explains how that hermeneutic of reform and continuity that Benedict has said. So that's where I draw a lot of helpful from this book. This book is kind of more scholarly, so it may not be the best one for everyone to read. So, the dignity of the human person. First, the fathers look at these different worldly ideas of human dignity. And it doesn't match with what the church says. So the church wants to be in dialogue with those who do not believe the same thing. We're not just going to cut ourselves off, but we want to help them answer this question as to who and what are we? What are we really? What are we all about? And these different and even contradictory opinions about who we are causes a lot of doubt and anxiety. We can definitely see that in the world. There's a lot of division that occurs because of various explanations of who we are, who are we meant to be. So the church, through all this, is there to discern the true signs of God's presence and what his purpose is, what he's supposed to do. Because certain worldly ideas of dignity, sometimes it's based upon our capacity to make choices. So you have dignity as long as you can make choices. If you're in a state in which you no longer can make a choice, well, then you've lost dignity. You've lost your dignity. Or sometimes you'll hear quality of life arguments, especially in the medical field, that if you don't have a certain quality of life, you don't have dignity anymore. Well, it's true. Our quality of life has an effect upon how our dignity is expressed. Quality of life can never remove our dignity. And we'll talk about these two aspects of our dignity. There's a permanent aspect, and there's an aspect of our dignity which can be perfected. And then another one is, it'll be if you're able to communicate verbally or explicitly with another person, that means you have dignity. But if other people aren't able to tell that you can communicate, then you no longer have dignity. Perhaps you can think of examples of where that's come forward. So the church is going to reject those worldly ideas of human dignity. Instead, human dignity is based upon us being the imago Dei, the image of God. So we go back to the beginning. Now we were created in the image and likeness of God. And because we were, now we, like God, have the ability to know and love. We have this spiritual soul. So we're not simply physical body, but we have a spiritual soul that's made after God's image that can do the same things he can, only on a lower level. So God can know and love, and so can we. Just we can't know and love infinitely like he can. Also, the way that God made us was male and female. And so part of that, our dignity, comes in our ability to enter into relationships with others, this interpersonal communion between each other. And so that'll come up especially when we get to the section later on about marriage. And since we are created male and female, we're created in the image and likeness of God, in the image and likeness of the Trinity. We're by our nature social. So that'll come, and it'll talk more about us being social beings in one of the sections of this document. And of course, God made us, He made us very good. So that's the initial source of man's dignity, is being created in God's image and likeness with these elements. Body and soul, male and female, created good in God's image and likeness. But secondly, the other half of our dignity comes from the fact that we are redeemed by Christ and called to communion with God. So God's purpose for making us, that we've talked about in other sessions, is that God wants to share His divine life with us. And so that, as the source of our great dignity, that's what we've been created for, is to share in His divine life. So that's really our end or purpose, is communion with God. So based upon this, you can tell that this is something permanent. This can never be removed. Our dignity is something permanent because it's intrinsic to who we are. So unlike some of those other examples where you might have dignity at this moment, but this moment you might not anymore, ours, it's permanent. There's nothing that can happen to remove that dignity. Not even sin. So we were created in a state of holiness, but then we abused our freedom to be able to make choices, that freedom that allows us to love. But instead we chose not to love. And so now we have a split within ourselves because of sin. But still, we still retain our dignity. It's still permanent. Now, our image we distort the image. We lose our likeness to God. But the image remains, even if it's distorted and we can no longer understand our image being created in God. It's an image as easily. So, this is the permanent part. But dignity also has to be perfected. Now that we've sinned, there's going to be aspects of our sin being perfected. Because sin attacks our dignity. When we sin or someone sins against us, our dignity is under attack. So for example, in the area of the intellect, so there's the two areas we can know and we can love. So our intellect knows. So that our intellect has to be perfected now because it's been affected by sin. And it's perfected by the virtue of wisdom. The document says, our era needs such wisdom more than bygone ages if the discoveries made by man are to be further humanized. For the future of the world stands in peril unless wiser men are forthcoming. Also, our will has to be perfected. Our ability to make choices. And that's what obeying our conscience is all about. If we obey our conscience, then our dignity is perfected. Of course, what does conscience mean? We have to make sure that we understand what conscience is. So, conscience, the document says, is the most secret core and sanctuary of man, where he's alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. So it's a place within us where God speaks to us. And so this is a diagram of how conscience works. So here we have our conscience, and it's the place where God speaks. So he speaks through his divine law, also through the natural law in the world. He speaks to us. Also, and then what we do is we take what are the concrete actions that we're trying to decide whether or not this is good, and we compare it in our conscience. So we have our perception, our understanding of God's law and the natural law, our understanding of the action. We compare the two to each other, and we have to make a practical judgment. And if we judge that this action is in conformity with God's law, with natural law, then the act is good, and we can do it. If we make the judgment that it's not in conformity with the natural law, then the act is evil, and so we should not do it. So, obeying a right conscience, a well-formed conscience, builds up our dignity. So we have to our conscience has to be formed, so we need to know what God's divine law is. So it's not just, well, my conscience is whatever I think is right. We have to be following God's law. That's what. So if we obey our conscience, then it helps perfect our dignity. All right. When we speak of making choices and following our conscience, we also have to speak of freedom. Because the world sees freedom a lot of times in different ways that the church does. So freedom does not equal simply a license to do whatever we want. That kind of a freedom will not necessarily perfect dignity, our human dignity. Because the freedom that we have is damaged by sin, and now we don't always understand what it is that will give us freedom. Freedom is really the freedom to choose the good, to choose what's good for us. And in order to do that, our will has to be assisted by God's grace. The Council Fathers go into the presence of death and kind of how to understand that. Because in a sense, the world's certain inability to understand what death is. He says, man rebels against death because he bears in himself an eternal seed which cannot be reduced to sheer matter. The reason why we don't want to think about death, or a lot in our culture just tries to avoid it at all costs, is because it bears witness that we're made for more than simply what we have here on earth. Of course, we weren't created for death. Death came because of our sin, and God didn't want us to live forever in a fallen state. He wanted us to live forever in communion with Him. So that's why He allowed death to come in. But Christ defeated death in His own death and resurrection. So now we are able to enter into communion with God. So there's Jesus defeating death. That's an icon of Jesus pulling Adam and Eve up out of the place of the dead on Holy Saturday. So being called to communion again is our true end. That's what we're meant for. All right. Within this context of our human dignity, the reason why it's so important is because a lot of questions that come up, especially it mentions atheism. As it says, must be accounted among the most serious problems of this age, and all those kinds of things that relate to it. Agnosticism. So not coming to a conclusion whether or not there's a God. Or scientism, thinking that science is the only thing that can provide answers. Relativism, there is no set truth. The problem of evil, there can't possibly be a God because there's evil in the world. Or a desire for autonomy from God, that if we have to, that would take away from ourselves if we actually had to submit ourselves to God. But the church responds and says we have to believe that recognizing God doesn't in no way supplants our dignity, because our dignity is rooted on God. We've come from Him, and it's perfected in our relationship with Him. So it doesn't diminish it. It doesn't make us smaller saying that we're subordinated to God. To say that we had this absolute autonomy from God and could do whatever we want doesn't increase our dignity. In fact, it'll end up destroying it. So it says the remedy of that involves a couple things. The proper presentation of the church's teaching, so we have to know it and have the courage to say what they are. And then also the integral life of the church and its members. So living out the faith as a witness, that this is not just something theoretical, but it's a truth that can be lived out and will make you happy and will increase your dignity. One of the most important paragraphs in the document, at least from the witness of John Paul II, because he quoted this paragraph all the time, is Gaudium et Spes 22. And it focuses on Jesus Christ as being the perfect man, the one who shows us what it means to be human. So So it says, the truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. So this questioning of who are we, the only way we can fully understand it is because Jesus Christ has become man. And it says that Jesus Christ fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme call clear. So the more we get to know Jesus, he's going to reveal to us who we are. And it's going to make our purpose, our meaning in life, clearer. So this is something, and this even is it's going to be part of our presentation of the truth to the world. That this is what we have to offer them. That if they want to know who they are, to look to Christ. We already mentioned how he helps solve the riddle of suffering and death. He gives meaning to that. Being connected with him perfects dignity. And dignity really is a gift. It's not just something we do on our own. It has to be received, the perfection of the dignity. So this is going to be, that's a very important paragraph, is Gaudium et Spes 22. And it really puts the whole document into context. Because when God is forgotten in the world, then we become unintelligible. We can't understand who we are if we separate ourselves from God. So there's a kind of, the whole document needs to be understood in light of Jesus being the perfect man, and that he reveals to us who we are. So that was the section on human dignity. So the next principle, and that's really kind of a fundamental principle, especially in all of the kind of social teachings of the church. It's the fundamental one, is that we're on human dignity. So that's why we spent it's a good section on that. The community of mankind. So now we're going to go into the fact that we're social beings. And really it follows us being made in the image of the Trinity, like I mentioned earlier. Jesus prayed to the Father that all may be one as we are one. So our unity, the unity that we should have, should be the same kind of unity as the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit have. Think about it. That's an amazing idea. To be that unified, that all of us would be unified together in the same way that the persons of the Trinity are. Not that we become God or lose our personalities, but it's that kind of, and that's the kind of unity that we'll experience in its fullness in heaven. So there's a likeness between the unity of divine persons and the unity of all of us together, God's other sons. And this is the other quote that you would hear John Paul II saying all the time. So it's your other very important quote from the document. Man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. So you could call this the law of the gift. John Paul II uses it everywhere, and many of the things that he wrote was based upon these two things. This document is developing a picture on anthropology, an understanding of what man is. And so those are important. So we can't understand ourselves apart from Christ, because he reveals who we are. And then we will understand ourselves the more we give ourselves away. We're meant to be a gift to others, because that's exactly what God is. He's an infinite, relationship of gift of one to the other. And of course, we have to be perfected in this ability to give ourselves. And that's really what love is. It's a gift of self for the good of the other. All right. So, based upon that thought, our social life, a life in connection with other people's, there should be a protection, and the protection and perfection of social life depends upon several different levels of communities that are formed. The family is fundamental. Voluntary organizations that are formed, the church, political communities. And all of these can assist in realizing, it says, the religious dimension. So not just physical aspects of who we are, but also we're both body and soul. Also, the social order should lead to the common good. And we'll talk about what the church means by common good in the next slide here. But it also notices that in the modern world there are defects in social order, and that ultimately originate because we are defected by sin. So we'll see later that to overcome the defects in social order means we have to overcome the defects within ourselves as well. So the common good is, it feels like a very broad definition. It says the common good is the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. So, depends on what does it mean to fulfill them? So their ability to become fulfilled in who they are. Well, the church doesn't mean it's simply, to have a good economy, to have a protection of their rights, to have good health care, to have a clean environment. Those are important things, but it's not enough for the common good. To develop the common good, you have to pay attention to truth and justice and love and virtue and duty. So you see, it's not simply something exterior to man, but it deals with their interior life, the fact that we are spiritual beings. So the church, when it later addresses specific things, it's going to bring up those things that, you're for the common good. But the common good is not simply, these material type things, which are part of it, but not all of it. So, for the common good, law should not allow on a number of things. Murder, genocide, abortion, all those things. Attempts to coerce the will, disgraceful working conditions, and others. So all those things attack human dignity. But one thing that does mention is that it attacks the dignity of those who suffer the injustice, but it attacks the dignity of those who do them even more, because they're the ones actually committing the sin. So the sin attacks the dignity even more than those who are sinned against. All right, yes. They all attack human dignity. All right, so the church in society. So where do we have a role? So God does not save us as mere individuals, but he wants to make us into a single people. And so that's why we have the church, and the church can make a significant contribution to the common good of society. And so some of the things that come later will show exactly how does the church do that. Because some would question that today. Like, we don't need the church because you're no help to our society. Even though it's objectively it's really hard to say that, because we do a lot of things that assist society. Man's activity throughout the world. So we kind of went smaller in society, but now we're going to go into the broader picture of the world as well. So it mentions, the Council Fathers mentions how there's this, how we strive to better our life, and that's a very good thing. Both individually and then throughout the world together, we try to do that. And it specifically mentions science and technology, of how that's increased, and we use that to try to better our life. And those are very good things. And it's in itself, all that activity is in accordance with God's will. He wants us to do those things. So it says the triumphs of the human race are a sign of God's grace and the flowering of his own mysterious design. So that's part of his design, is this kind of bettering of our life through our abilities, through science and technology. But it also warns that progress can also bring temptation, because we're at all times in what it says a monumental struggle against the powers of darkness that pervade the whole history of man. So there's always going to be opposition to progress. It's not automatic. It's not simply whatever comes next is better. It's not always going to progress like that. So all human activity is imperiled by man's pride and self-love. And so it has to be purified and perfected by Christ's power in his cross and resurrection. So I use this image is the first morning, mourning as in sorrow, Mourning by William Adolphe Bouguereau, I think. I don't know if you know who that is. It's the first morning, so what this is a picture of Adam and Eve mourning Abel's death. And the beautiful thing that I love about it is it looks like the Pieta. Mm-hmm. And if you notice Adam's hand there, it's an M. Artists would they'd put they would do that for Mary. The M stands for Mary. So Abel, so that represents the pride and self-love of what Cain did to Abel, but then it can be perfected and transformed by the power of Christ's death and resurrection. So I think that painting shows forth as this kind of, first morning, this forerunner to the Pieta that would really transform us. All right. So human progress. Will it come about through scientific technology? Will we get a just society simply through scientific technology? It's not enough. It will never be able to produce it on its own. Only through Christ's commandment of love can a just society come about. Science and technology, of course, can assist in that, but in and of itself, it's not sufficient to bring that kind of just society that everyone would long for. All right. So, the role of the church in the modern world. So now we've looked at some of the principles, and those principles are going to form the basis of understanding the relationship of the church in the modern world. So, the dignity of the human person we talked about, human community, and then the meaning of human activity, the forward progression of it. Form a foundation. Also, this document also has to be understood in the light of the document on the church that we talked about, Lumen Gentium. So the ecclesiology of community that we learned about how the church is, probably the best way to think of it is in terms of the reception of communion. We're being transformed together into unity of one by Christ in the image of the Trinity. So this ecclesiology of communion also forms the background of the things that go on in this document. So the church is the leaven and soul of human society. So the mission of the church is for salvation, and then our eschatological purpose, which means future time. Eschatology is about things that happen in the future. So our ultimate purpose resides in the future, heaven, communion with God. So the purpose is to bring salvation to people so they can attain that final end. So in order to do that, the church serves as leaven and a kind of soul in human society. So the things that it does is it communicates divine life through sacraments, through the church itself. It then teaches the truth of revelation, a lot of the truths that we've mentioned already. And it promotes the human dignity, so you understand who we are, especially in the light of Christ and in the light of the fact that we find ourselves by giving ourselves as a gift. That dignity is both a given, it's permanent, never changes, but it's also a goal. It has to be perfected. And it says that it keeps society together by forming conscience. So without a well-formed conscience, without people with well-formed consciences, society will fall apart. Then it speaks of human rights, that human rights are good. we have rights. So to continue to grow in discovery and of our rights. But in determining what our rights are, there has to be certain criteria. It has to be based upon an objective moral standard. We can't just, we say we have a right to something that's not moral. that is opposed to our dignity. Also, the church has to protect rights from the idea that rights can be based upon a false autonomy, that we have no requirements towards following God's law, that we're simply, it's my right, I can do whatever I want, as opposed to, well, no, actually, only you don't have a right to that because it's contrary to God's divine law. So the church has to be a witness of helping to evaluate what rights are real rights. In the just political order in the world, how does the church fit in with political order? Well, the church doesn't take the responsibility of establishing justice in the political order. Injustice in the church's mind has two elements. It's rendering to God what's owed to God, and then rendering to others what are owed to them. So there's the two forms of justice. But in the political order, the church doesn't take responsibility, and we'll get in later more details about political order and the political society and what exactly the church's role is in greater detail. But the church will benefit political society as it pursues its mission. So its first mission is not to establish justice in the political order. That's not its mission. But its mission is to form consciences, or its mission is the salvation of souls so that we can reach our final end. And in the process, it forms consciences, it clarifies that justice means for God and for man, and it reawakens our understanding of that we're spiritual creatures within us. So it's going to make an effect in society, especially through you, the laity. And that's why when we talked about the apostolate of the laity, you are in places in the world in which you make those practical contributions to those areas. So the church has no proper mission in the political, economic, or social order, and so it can be at ease with any government that respects her religious freedom and the rights of individuals. So, but you will find Catholic social doctrine seeking to persuade that some form of constitutional government seems to work best in contemporary society. Of course, it has to be one where civil law is in conformity with moral law. Also, vice versa, the church can be enriched by society itself. So the church knows that she's profited through all the developments that have occurred through history. And so, for example, in the early church, even in the time of the Gospels already, like St. John's Gospel, they use the ideas and terminology of the Greek philosophers to better express the gospel. So like the concept of Jesus being the Word, the Logos, that comes from Greek philosophy. And so it was used to assist in spreading the message of Christ. While helping the world and receiving many benefits from it, the church has a single intention, that the kingdom, God's kingdom, may come, and that the salvation of the whole human race may come to pass. So that's what the church is going to be focused on. That's not even necessarily properly what the world or what political society is focused on. Well, that'll become more apparent when we get into some of the second half of the document that gets into some of the more practical things. So that's the first half of the document. Do we have any questions? Yep.
The part where church doesn't accept responsibility for establishing political order and the following.
Mm-hmm.
Is that doctrinal in nature? Or
That is doctrinal in nature, yeah. But I'll explain exactly what that means, or in greater detail what that means later.
In the historical context.
Oh, yeah, in historical context?
Because
Mhm.
that may be true now, but the church did accept responsibility for, a big chunk of the first millennium. And
Yeah.
probably a big chunk of the second millennium.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. I mean, there was a lot more kind of overlap as to how much that it was that it did take in charge, because so Yeah, but what it's recognizing is that that's not the mission of the church per se. The church is interested in that because it affects human dignity, human life. It affects our eternal salvation, all those temporal things.
I get my questions lead to, can that change? Can events, times, cultures, everything change so the church at some point can accept responsibility for political order, and in order to satisfy support its ultimate mission? But I mean, can it accept responsibility for political order as it had in the past? I know it's recognizing they don't today, and that's why I was asking, is this a doctrinal nature that's something that can't be changed, or a recognition of the error in the past, or is this something that can be modified and changed based on what's happening, 500 years from now?
Well, I think it would recognize, in practice, a lot of things that happened throughout history, the church did, there was overlap between, the state and the church, a lot more than you see today. But I think this is, it's helping to clarify that the church's proper role isn't necessarily that, to take control of that. Would it assist with it? Yes. Could it at certain times have a lot of assistance with that? Yeah. And like in the past. But is it its first and foremost role that Christ gave to it? No, it's not. It's but I think it will, when we get to the second section, when we have so the second section here on life of the political community, I think that might assist you a little bit with some specific of how that interprets into some specifics. Yeah, because there are parts in this document that, and there's other things that it speaks in broad and general terms, and it's basing itself upon social teaching of the church before it. So in some things it assumes those teachings, and so it doesn't always clarify in the way that it says it in here. But I think in this latter part it'll assist in that. Yeah. But yeah, the church's proper role is not to take over those kind of the political state role. But that's a good question. All right, so that was a lot of concepts, doctrines. So the second half is going to apply it to more specifics. It's going to take those things in the first, the dignity of the human person, community, the broader view of the and the role of the church in the world. It's going to apply them to these specific areas. So the first is fostering the nobility of the marriage and the family. So the well-being of individuals and all of society is intimately linked with the health of marriage and the family. So it goes through a number of problems of today, meaning back at the time of the council. And so many of them continue to apply today. Many of them are to a greater level than they were at that time. Divorce, free love, other disfigurements, so includes whatever. Excessive self-love, the worship of pleasure, illicit practices against human generation, disturbances in family by economic conditions, social and psychological influences, problems, population growth. You don't find things like same-sex marriage in there because that wasn't really an issue yet at that time. But some of the concepts that we find today will also apply to that as well. The nature of marriage, based upon those principles that we had earlier, it's established by the Creator. And so therefore it's qualified under His laws. He's the one who determines what marriage is. And it describes it as the conjugal covenant of irrevocable personal consent. So that's complicated word. So basically it's a mutual gift of two persons, one to the other. in Paul XI, in Casti Connubii, which came earlier, says that souls are joined together more intimately than their bodies, not by any passing affection, but by deliberate and firm act of the will, a sacred and inviolable bond. So it requires an act of the will, that you will to give yourself to the other for their good. And then the second part of it is it's for the procreation and education of children, which the document says is the crown of marriage. So let's look at those two. So you may have heard that marriage is unitive and procreative. Those are the two big meanings of marriage. So the union of the spouses and the good of the children. And because that is the purpose of marriage, for the union of the spouses and the good of the children, what follows from that is total fidelity on the spouses. In order, and an unbreakable oneness. You can't break it. Because it's meant to unify the spouses and for it's the good of the children. It requires that kind of fidelity. And part of the reason is because the love is going through bears divine love. This is based upon the principle we talked about earlier of how Christ reveals man to himself. That we're a total gift to each other. So authentic married love is caught up into divine love, the divine self-giving. So that's why we have St. Paul say to the Ephesians that husbands and wives should love. Husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church. So the love between the husband and the wife mirrors the love of Christ in the church. So there is an example of Christ revealing to man who he is. Then also the Trinity, the life of the husband and wife, the life of the Trinity. You have the Father who loves the Son infinitely, and the Son infinitely loves the Father back, and the love between them is so real that it is a third person, the Holy Spirit. Same thing in the family. You have the total gift of love of the husband to the wife, and the wife back to the husband. And the gift of love is so real that it opens up the possibility of producing a new life that is a third person, their children. So it's in the image of the self-giving love of the Trinity. So to change what marriage is would be to call into question marriage being in the image of God. So actually it calls into question who God is in his very essence, the relationship with Jesus and the church, as well as the relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So attacks on what marriage is goes not only attacks our own dignity, but attacks who God is, because our dignity is based on him.
Is it not just who God is, but the existence of God in general?
Yeah, and I'm sure that some would then deny God's existence as part of that. Yeah, because we're basically, if God is not, we believe God is Trinity. If God's anything other than Trinity, we're in a sense atheists in that sense. We don't believe that kind of a God exists. We only believe a triune God exists. So, indissolubility. So this total gift of self within marriage is bestowed from one person to the other and reciprocated back. It cannot be renounced. It's in the image of God. God's love is not renounced. And all marital actions should be configured to this kind of self-giving love. If it's renounced, if this love is renounced, it turns into its opposite. The opposite of love is use. Using the other person. It's not lust. You might think it's lust, but it's use. If you read John Paul II, and his theology of the body stuff kind of comes out of things that you see here in Gaudium et Spes and the whole tradition of the church. Using, treating the other person as an object, which really, that's what lust is too. It's related to that. But John Paul II reflects on how the opposite of love is use, because you don't treat them like the person. Children are the supreme gift of marriage. And it says they contribute very substantially to the welfare of their parents. You might think, well, the parents should contribute to the welfare of the children. Well, that's true. The children can't live without them. But the children also contribute to the welfare of the parents. If you think about it, it forces them to grow in virtue and self-gift. So, so it says, children manifest this mutual self-give of the parents. It's very visible to see them, this fact of the self-gift. Marriage possesses a whole manner and communion of life, and though at the same time, marriage in of itself, even without children, maintains this life of communion. So even if a couple is unable to have children, they still retain this what it is of mutual self-gift. So the self-gift involves all of us, so it involves our intellect. So for the husband and wife to make judgments about their welfare and that of their children, for those who have been born and those who may be born in the future. And you have to take into account material and spiritual conditions of the times as well as their state in life. So you can see kind of, this is leading to the concepts behind natural family planning. True judgments must share, but whatever judgments they make have to share in the wisdom of God's law. Trusting in His providence with the spirit of sacrifice. So it's not just we made this decision together apart from what God's laws are in a kind of selfish way. But no, it has to be in this spirit of trust in Him and knowing what His laws are. So it mentions how illicit methods of birth control, abortion, infanticide, all those things distort marriage, and distorts marriage's reasonableness. And in that way, it distorts the truth of the mutual self-gift. So it should come to no surprise that many are at a loss of understanding that marriage is meant to be a mutual self-gift. Because those kinds of things, when they become present, distort marriage's reasonableness to people. Within the family, it talks about the roles of the father and the mother, the active presence of the father, having great benefit, and the children, especially the younger among them, need the care of their mother at home. This domestic role of hers must be safely preserved, though the legitimate social progress of women should not be underrated on that account. It mentions how family helps to bring the generations together. That assists in helping them grow in becoming, in their dignity, becoming who they fully are, is the interaction between the various generations. I can think of when our 5th graders went to go visit people at Papillion Manor, of how beneficial that was to both of them, the interaction between the generations like that. So it says that public authority should regard it as a duty to recognize, protect, and promote the authentic nature of marriage and to shield public morality and favor the prosperity of home life. So, yeah. Do we see that? All right, so that is the marriage section, and so you notice there's a lot more practical kinds of things, and you can see applications of where things that the church says needs to be continually said today, because there's many ways in which the marriage and family are being attacked now, probably even more so than at the time of the council. All right, so proper development of culture. Culture and human nature. Culture is connected to who we are as in human nature. So wherever human life is involved, nature and culture are quite intimately connected. So what is culture? So here's your very broad definition of culture. Let's see if it helps you understand what it is. Everything whereby man develops and perfects his many bodily and spiritual qualities. So it's very broad. Everything that helps us perfect who we are, not just physically, not just bodily, but also spiritually. So the document gives this kind of brief sketch of the present state of human culture, and I'm not going to go into the details of what it looked at, but technology was a huge thing, and today it still has a huge impact upon our culture, upon all of those things that help us develop and perfect who we are. So it has technology has a great potential for cultural creativity. And throughout the world, we have a great plurality of cultures, many different kinds of cultures. So think about that. Everything whereby man develops and protects his many bodily and spiritual qualities. So there's the two parts. It affects the whole of man. So looking at some of those things in culture, growth of the sciences, technological process, advances in communication, industrialization, urbanization, increase of commerce throughout the world. In response to all these things, the Council Fathers are very optimistic. They remain quite optimistic too. Some people try to fault the document for being too optimistic about certain things. But it should be read within the context of the entire document, because it does, like it mentions on here, mention the difficulties. So it will be very optimistic at certain things that it says, but it's also it's going to call culture and society to evaluate itself, to change when it needs to change. So here it's optimism, birth of a new humanism in which man is defined first of all by this responsibility to his brothers and to history. And now this humanism that it refers to, and I think I mentioned humanism before? Yeah, so humanism is like these philosophies that are based upon the great value and what the human being can do. And so a lot of humanisms, especially like more atheistic ones, cuts you off from God and just, what can man do on his own? Well, when the church speaks of humanism, there's a Christian humanism that in a sense is based upon what we saw earlier in the document, that we know Christ reveals to us who we are. So we have to have this connection to God in order to be fully human. So the humanism that the church desires is one that doesn't separate us from God. So it's not accepting, you could interpret it as, look, the church is accepting atheistic, humanistic type philosophies, and it's not at all. In fact, it's quite rejects it. Benedict XVI said that a humanism that excludes Christ is an inhuman humanism. So, you need to have proper development of culture. Arts and sciences are expressions of both theoretical and practical wisdom, and the church makes uses of the great cultural fruits that comes. So, just like we mentioned earlier, the church is not bound in any kind of society or politics, neither is it bound to one culture. It covers all cultures. And here's one of the dangers that it mentions. When science and technology focus solely on what's observable with an agnosticism to everything else. So the only thing that really we know anything about are the physical things that we can see. Well then, it's going to lead to certain ideas, a false sense of autonomy, this rejection that God even exists. Or the idea that the church is one of these outdated cultures that we just throw off to the side. Who needs the church? Who needs religion anymore? But remember, the culture is what perfects man's bodily and spiritual qualities. That we're not simply just what we observe. We are more than that. So, culture's purpose is for the perfection of the human person. That's what culture is meant for, to the good of the community of the society. So, the perfection of the human person, and in perfecting the human person altogether, that means the common good. So if you remember, the common good that we talked about earlier has to do with not just physical type goods, but also has to do with truth and justice and love and virtue and those things. So culture has a purpose or end. And in order to know the end of culture, you have to know human nature. Like we talked about earlier, the dignity being based upon being created in God's image. And then the end that's understood in the light of Christ is being saved and called to communion with God. And the place that we learned what our end is, the place that we learned what our purpose is primarily in the family. That's where we need to learn who it is that we are. So we learn that we are created in God's image and likeness. The children learn from their parents what it means to make yourself a gift to another in love. The parents model that for them. All right. Christians and culture. What do we do in reaction to the cultures? How do we interact with them? So Christians should seek to imbue culture activities with the wisdom that we have, knowing what our end purpose is. Knowing who we are should help us to form the culture. So we have to ensure that religious culture and morality keep pace, especially in a kind of culture that's formed so much by a technology that goes really, really fast. We have to be able to ensure that, not necessarily that we don't want to be like ever-changing like technology. Yeah, that's not what that means. To keep pace doesn't mean to change, but it means to be able to call at every moment the people back to these unchanging truths in the midst of all this, of all the changing culture. One aspect of it is to help those men skilled in various disciplines to attain a better understanding of the faith. So today, there's so many people that are experts in fields, in single fields. And there's a certain mentality in places that, well, since I'm an expert over here in this, now I also think I'm an expert in spiritual things. Well, no, actually, your understanding of spiritual realities, your understanding of philosophy and theology is really not much greater than a grade schooler. You might be a doctorate over in this area, but you haven't really studied any of this. So the things you're saying really are in a sense, laughable to those who know some of that. And that's true to some of our new atheists that you read, is that if you know philosophy at all, they're making all of the simple fundamental mistakes when they're doing it. So, our relationship with culture. Then the next section is on economic and social life. So, once again, we have to remember that we're ordered to a proper end. And so is economic and social life. The man is the source and center and the purpose of it. It's for us. So it has to conform to our end. So the purpose of economics is not merely for just to produce products, nor is it for just simply for greater profit or control of things, but it's meant for the service of man and the whole of man. His whole range of material needs, his intellectual, his moral, his spiritual, religious life. So, because sometimes products, there are things produced that are not of service of man, that they don't regard the whole of man, or they think that a certain good is actually a false good. It's not something that builds up the dignity of the human person. It's not something that leads us to our end. And so by offering that product, they're making money on this, but they're making money destroying who the human person is. So there's many examples of that we can find. Some more principles dealing with economics. So the end is obscured. The purpose of economy is obscured when only a few people have that power. So the church says economics should neither be individualistic laissez-faire, so just having, everybody can do whatever they want, have that kind of freedom, nor should it be controlled absolutely by government. Both of those things, if it's totally individualistic, then you're not concerned with the common good. If it's totally government, then you're not concerned with the individual dignity of our ability to do those things. So there needs to be a balance between those two. So human beings in the economic process can never be used simply as tools for production, because they're persons. And that would be the same. We're meant to be a gift to each other, not to be used. So the main purpose of economics is not just simply for profit, but it's for the service of man, so that we will attain our end. Then it goes into a few specific areas, and I don't give all the details of those. So just wage for the labor, so that you can cultivate a life materially, social, cultural, spiritual life, and for those of the one who's working his dependents. So a just wage that, so that's at the service of man. That kind of a just wage would be at the service of man. Labor unions, there's a right to freely found labor unions. Private property, there's a right to have a share in the earthly goods sufficient for yourself and the family. Not just material property, but also immaterial property, like professional capacities. So, those are properties. So if that's how you're earning your wage, you should be given a proper wage for, your intellectual capacities that you have. And then it goes into the monetary system, distribution of land. The Council of Fathers remind us that whoever in obedience to Christ seeks first the kingdom of God takes therefrom a stronger and purer love for helping all his brethren and perfecting the work of justice under the inspiration of charity. So it's reminding us that, some would claim that, we have to get rid of, especially, this stems from their interaction with communism, that you have to get rid of religion because it's, the opiate of the masses, and keeps you, it needs to be gotten rid of because it takes your focus off of the things to do now to this future world. Well, the document's saying no, that if you seek first the kingdom of God, it should lead you to do these worldly things of assisting everyone, working towards justice and inspiring you to charity. All right, political community. They begin on a positive note, that today there seems to be a keener sense of human dignity leading to better protection of rights of the person in political life. Greater rights to meet and form associations, the right to express one's own opinion, to profess one's religion both publicly and privately. So some will say, well, they're so positive, and they've just come from a number of really, communism is still going on. The world wars are, 20 years behind them, and so now they're being too positive. Well, it's in view of some of the hopeful movements against some of the communists and totalitarian regimes that they say some of these things. There's the call to establish political life on a truly human basis, so one that's in line with the concepts of the dignity that we talked about earlier. So a sense of justice and kindliness, a service of, again, the common good, which is not simply the physical material things, but also those aspects of truth and love and virtue. So politics are meant for the common good. So human beings are political because of the common good. Ultimately, our common good is God, toward which human nature is directed. So political community exists solely for the common good. So the common good was the whole of those things in the social life that allow us to achieve our fulfillment, our end. So it's not simply just for a flourishing economy, protection of rights, good health care, clean environment, but all those other things that go with it. And it's founded on human nature, so belongs to the order designed by God. So even though the choice of the type of political regime is left there's freedom there, especially left to the citizens, but the fact that we have political authority, that comes from God. So, but it can be structured in different ways. So, here. So but even though the church says that it encourages democratic forms, because ones that remain within because they can remain within in full conformity with human nature, and they provide citizens with the possibility of being able to establish the foundations of the political life, to be able to involve in public affairs. They can elect officials. There are certain forms of political life that are not in conformity with human nature. So like communism, for example, it's not possible for it to be in conformity with human nature, because in a sense it places, instead in a democracy, the family and the upholding of the individuals and their dignity forms the basis, where in communism it's flipped the other way around, that they're basically become, to be used for the whole economic and political and social process, but they're not upholding the main concern are not the individuals themselves. Okay, so rights and duties it talks about. So rights, in talking about rights, the church doesn't mean that simply this complete autonomy, as we mentioned, but it flows from what's needed for the common good. So our rights are not simply individual rights, but it's what is good, some of those conditions that are good for leading all of us together to our fulfillment. So it says the rights in that context of all persons, all families and groups have to be recognized, respected, and furthered. But at the same time, we also have duties, which include rendering the political community such material and personal service as required for the common good. So we have rights that are given to us by being part of a political society, but we also have a duty of service toward that society for the common good of all that are part of it. Specifically, there's a section for political parties. It is never allowable to give their interest priority over the common good. We need that principle? Okay, so what's the role of the church in politics? So this is going to address your question. So, politics and the church, both of them serve the common good. So this is political life over here. This is the church over here. So both serve the common good. In political life is imbued with virtue through those who take part in it. So through the citizens that take part in it, insofar as they have virtue within them, then you'll find virtue within the political system. Its main aims are at temporal goods. Hopefully the temporal goods that they're aimed at are ordered to the eternal goods, but they're not always. In and of itself, the political life cannot bring about the kingdom of God, but it can only lead us to temporal ends. Hopefully those temporal ends are in line with the kingdom of God, but they may not be. The church, on the other hand, doesn't aim at temporal goods. It aims at the kingdom of God. But it doesn't neglect temporal goods. So, since it's aimed at the kingdom of God and not temporal goods, it's not identified in any way with any particular political community or bound by any political system. Because politics is aimed at the temporal goods, but the church is aimed at the ultimate, eternal good, the church itself. So you see, they're aimed at different things. They're going to interact with each other, but their aim is different. So
by their nature, the church exists outside of really the law.
Yes. Yeah. So to speak of the church in political terms makes no sense. That's why, especially with all the stuff going on with conclave and the new pope, that people can't understand it. Because you're right, they're interpreting it within this political framework. They're looking at it in terms of temporal power, temporal goods. If you interpret it in that way, it's going to be inexplicable, because it isn't about that at all. It's about the aims of the kingdom of God. So it was kind of hilarious. I read an article about how, so they were talking about two different camps of cardinals, the ones in the Roman Curia and the ones coming from all about the world. And so each of them have their idea of who they want to be pope. And so a couple nights ago, they had Vespers, evening prayer, all the cardinals together. And so this article said, the Curia, they wanted to stop the other cardinals from meeting together and talking about stuff. So they filled up the agenda with prayer. And I'm like, what? So you see, that's what a political mind thinks. When we're interpreting it in terms of these categories, when it's like, no, they're cardinals that are priests and holy men of God, and they pray. So they're going to pray together. So, I don't know, it was just absurd. Yeah?
Okay. This comes right up to
Mhm.
before does it, where it says the church doesn't accept responsibility to establish political order. Okay,
Yeah.
and I guess I'm referring or thinking of when the church basically had to fill a vacuum with the fall of Rome,
Mm-hmm.
leading to basically the administration of Rome and to the papal
Yeah.
states and all that. And on the right column there does not neglect the temporal good.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, so, I mean, is it possible or, and that's why I was actually, it's a doctrinal statement before, is it like the church thou shalt not? Or is it possible the church can step in and accept the normal governmental functions in the absence, if we say it,
Mhm.
another collapse of society. Is
Yeah.
it? I mean, in that case, would the church be able to accept responsibility for political order simply because they're the last man standing or the last
Yeah.
organization standing?
So what I would say to that is let's be clear, because the church is very broad. We're including both the hierarchy and the lay faithful, and I would say that is the role of the lay faithful. That should be your role anyway, right? We should desire Catholics to be in charge of, to be those leaders in our political life, and so the like I said, it should be imbued with virtue through its members. So those members, those Catholic laity, we want virtuous men and women to take those roles. Those that have this view of the world that the church has. The church hierarchy in particular, the priests and bishops, cardinals, the Pope, he's not given that role in particular. There's a better understanding of that now. And those times in which there was those overlaps was probably because, those were the only members of the church who would have been capable of doing that. So, but today, with so much education and, so many laity being able to do those kinds of things, it's your proper role as laity, more so than the hierarchy in the church. So in a sense, you're right. The church in its laity is where it's going to have that impact. So let's see. Yeah. So, but the hierarchy will have some influence in here as well. So the church requires from political communities a true freedom to preach their faith. We got to be free to be able to preach the truth, to teach our social doctrine, to exercise her role of passing moral judgments, especially when fundamental rights, or the salvation of souls require it. So if a political society is trying to make an evil into a good, we have to exercise that role of passing moral judgment on that, because salvation of souls is at stake. Not because we want to take over in the political area, but because we want no one to be lost. And so in this, we are going to profoundly challenge the political community to live up to the order of justice. Justice meaning that which is for man and for God. We're going to challenge them on that. And they're not going to like it, as we see now, and all the things that are happening. And is that they don't want to have anything to do with that. They think we're overstepping our bounds. Some of that will come in. This is the end of the document. Or wait, no, one more section. Sorry, jumped the gun. I thought it was the end. So I'll mention that again when we get to the what was good, what was bad, what needs to be done yet. So final section of the document: fostering peace and the promotion of a true community of nations throughout the world. So obviously the church is opposed to war. Should be no surprise. But not peace at the cost of justice. There needs to be justice too. So peace, it mentions, is not simply an absence of war. And it's not solely this maintaining a balance of power. Nor is it brought about by dictatorship of having somebody just say, this is the way it's going to be. But it's an enterprise of justice. True peace True peace really cannot be achieved by us alone, by human power. It has to come from Christ. The earthly peace which arises from love of neighbor symbolizes and results from the peace of Christ which radiates from God the Father. So that's why Jesus offers his peace. The true peace that comes to us can only come from Christ, but not the peace that we seek is not going to come from our own abilities. But at the same time, we don't adopt pacifism in the church, nor do we reject, but we don't reject if somebody's own practice of pacifism, not wanting to get involved in things. But in certain circumstances, our just war theory, basically, says that violence may be used in justly defending temporal goods. But there needs to be this mentality of a kind of renunciation of violence and only resorting to this for methods of defense. So a just defense, but never a subjugation of other nations to your own power. And so in this context, those who devote themselves to the military service of their country should regard themselves as the agents of security and freedom of peoples. So I put a picture of, does anyone know who that is up there? Top? That's servant of God, Father Emil Capon. Was a priest from Kansas, Wichita Diocese. Servant of God. So he was... Yeah, he was military chaplain.
Was he not just given some kind of honor?
Yes, he was given. What was he given by the United States? Yeah, he was given. I don't remember.
There was a push for sainthood.
Yeah, but yeah, he's already a servant of God. So his cause is open for sainthood. So insofar as men are sinful, the threat of war will always hang over us. And hang over us until the return of Christ. But insofar as man vanquishes sin by union of love, they will vanquish violence. So war and violence has its origin in personal sin. Okay, so it speaks about the horror of war, utterly rejecting many things like terrorism, methodological extermination of entire people. So you can see that it's thinking back, 20 years before that to the Holocaust and the horrors of that. The horror and perversity of war is immensely magnified by the addition of scientific weapons, and any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities, of extensive areas along with population, is a crime against God and man himself. So in light of atomic weaponry, speaking about the accumulation of arms, because now we're to the arms race was going on at the time. So it's not a safe way to preserve a steady peace. And an utterly treacherous trap for humanity. Because the disagreements between the nations are not healed in any way. You just kind of perpetuate them. So this goes into other details about that. Preventing war. Support should be given to those leaders who want to work to do away with war. International organizations, there's a support for that from the Council Fathers to reduce the likelihood of war. And the Church's role in that is to help establish this exchange between nations, and particularly to be able to help them understand the divine and human law, so that we treat everyone according to their proper dignity. War and economics, the connection between them, since war often stems from economic pressures, to improve international cooperation in economics, to assist in alleviating poverty. Also brings up the issue of population growth in that context of war and economics. That governments do have a certain role in issuing social and family legislation, but they always have to remember that only parents have the right to determine number of children. And that regulation of birth that they do always has to adhere to the moral law, as it mentioned earlier, and some of the specifics of this will come, and that area comes later with Paul VI and Humanae Vitae. but you already find its origin here in Gaudium et Spes. So, to conclude, the area of the Church, ultimately, in its dialogue in this realm of peace and discussion, is a call to conversion, because sin is what's at the root of all those larger conflicts. So calling to conversion, and in a sense being a witness of the possibility of unity even within a diversity. So we too, the Church, has to manifest the kind of unity. And actually that'll be the topic next time, the unity of the Church and our relationship with other Christians in dealing with that unity. So that is the document. Any questions before I go to asking the what was good, mistaken, still needs to be done? Everyone's in awe. No. All right, well, we'll bring up some of these. What in the acceptance of Gaudium et Spes was good? What was inadequate or mistaken? What still remains to be done? Does anyone have any ideas from some of those topics that we went through? What's been good about that? Have you seen anything catch hold? Maybe other things that haven't caught hold, or that have been pretty much, I don't know, ignored?
How do we criticize that? I mean,
what the document says?
Yeah, I mean.
Well, no, not criticizing what the document says, but I mean our experience after the document.
Oh, in the acceptance of it was good.
Yeah, so what in the acceptance of it was good,
I misread the question.
what was in its acceptance inadequate or mistaken? Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing, that I thought the document spoke well to was the culture of life,
Mm-hmm.
and clearly inspired, the pro-life movement.
Yeah.
As it gained momentum in the United States.
Oh yeah.
So I think that's really interesting, and it spoke to a number of life issues which were absolutely prophetic.
Mm-hmm.
Suicide.
Yeah, a lot of those things that it mentions in there.
Huge past
you see it a lot more now.
Absolutely.
And
so we're, it seems, that they had foresight about the technological possibilities for euthanasia and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think it was very inspirational there, and it motivated a lot of passion among the faithful for the defense of human life.
Yeah, it provides really that, and I'll mention that in the slide on good, it provides this framework of understanding who the human person is, this basis for talking about the dignity and why many of these practices are unacceptable.
I also think the basic structure of everything is like what we need as the church to how we need to respond to patients, and how we need to, our role in politics or not our role in politics, how you want to phrase that.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was helpful, but I don't see it happening at all.
Yeah, and that's one of there's something related to that when I get to the what was mistaken. Certain misinterpretations of certain parts of the document. Because there are certain, if you isolate certain pieces of it from the whole rest of it and from the church's tradition, you can make it say something else. Very easily. It's a hugely long document, so people do that with sacred scripture too. They isolate sections of it to make it mean whatever they want it to. And so they do that to this document as well.
And the media can do a very good job.
Yes, and the media do it as well. There's a very interesting, I'll bring that up when we talk about, there's a specific document that has to do with social communication that came from the council. But Pope Benedict, in his last talk with the clergy of Rome, talked about his own experience of the Second Vatican Council. And there's a whole section there where he talks about the council of the media versus the true council. And so today, the council of the media is losing a grip. And so we're now finally beginning to actually see the true council come up. And so it was very a beautiful, inspired, description that he's giving of his experience of the council itself. So it's really neat. And I'll put it up on the website sometimes if you're interested in reading that talk that Benedict gave.
It seems to me, and my impressions of Vatican II is that it was pastoral nature as a contrast to all the other councils that were reacting to heresies. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But tonight it seems it was reacting to, and not to a particular heresy,
Mm-hmm.
but certain situations that were, and that are going on then and continue going on now,
Yeah.
that they were reacting, they're addressing problems that they saw.
Yeah.
There's no labeling heresy particular, but if you, except maybe little parks, but this is wrong, but it's, I've never thought of it being a reactive council, but until tonight.
Well,
It seems to be somewhat of a reactive to two very big problems, that they were facing at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, in a sense, reacting, but in the whole sense of the document in a more positive light. So it wants to bring up the good things that are happening in the world, but it's also going to offer those warnings, and it's offering the eternal truth that the Church has to say that if you have an incorrect understanding of who we are, then it's going to lead us to some of these problems that we're getting ourselves into. So yeah, it's in a sense, some of the councils there was a specific issue that they were addressing, whereas in this council, and especially this document, it wanted to look at, well, what's going on in the world today, and the truth that has been given to us by God. How do we help the people? Because remember, the very first thing that it started out with, the joys and the hopes, the anxieties of the world are those same as the Church, that we are with them and that we care about them, and we care about the common good. We want their eternal salvation. We want what's going to make them fully flourish in perfecting their dignity. And so that's why we engage the world. The Church never wants to separate ourselves from the world and say, well, they're too far gone, we'll just let them go ahead on their own. But no, we take the much more difficult road of having to engage them. And that's why we have so much opposition towards us, because people don't like to be told that they're wrong. They don't like to be told that, how dare you say what I'm doing is not the best thing for me? How can you, even though if they really stop to think about it, we're offering them so much more than they want for themselves. So, yeah, in a certain sense it is reactionary because not necessarily reactionary, but it wants to be in dialogue with the things going on in the world so that we can, for the good of the world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of things that were inadequate or mistaken,
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking about the section on the family was very good for perhaps its historical moment.
Mm-hmm.
I think at this point in time,
Oh, yeah.
the magisterium would probably offer something more than the presence of fathers with their children is beneficial.
Yes, there was not a whole lot on fathers.
They would say it's essential, it's absolutely necessary. Two parents are required to raise children.
Yeah.
And they would elaborate, I believe.
Yeah, you have to take this within the whole,
Sure.
the vast range of. So you're right. I mean, obviously it couldn't say everything.
Full-scale breakdown of the family since that time.
Yeah. So at that time, there wasn't, the issues like, for example, of same-sex marriage wasn't even on the radar at all. So they don't mention anything like that. I mean, they mention.
But even same-sex marriage aside.
Yeah.
Even if we're just looking at the union of men and women
Mm-hmm.
in industrialized countries, particularly.
Mm-hmm. But I think what has been good is that the Church has built upon that. So you find documents on the family coming after that. So there's many things that this document, I mean, obviously a single document can't address everything. You're right, that sounds like, well, that's really kind of weak. And you're right, it is. I mean, it didn't spend a whole lot of time on the role on their roles, but it's developed a lot more, especially in John Paul II's theology of the body stuff and a lot of other things. So, but which this forms kind of the basis for that.
Not
That-
like that, Humanae Vitae didn't come out until 4 or 5 years after
Yeah.
that kind of, and I was, probably not many of you, I was here in 63 and 64. That stuff, what you're talking about, I mean, it was just, nobody conceived, that fathers wouldn't be essential.
Disappear, would
I mean,
disappear,
just what,
yeah.
what do you, I mean,
Yeah.
what? I mean,
Right,
it
right.
just wasn't even, there was homosexuality, but it was,
Sure.
it was so hidden, if you will, or it just wasn't apparent that, and the fact, and even within that community, they wouldn't have thought, well, fathers aren't essential, in terms of, marriage wasn't even an issue with them, in that community.
Well, and now I think they say half of U.S. children are born outside of marriage, so, so we're obviously in a whole new dimension at this
Yeah.
particular period of time. But, at the same time, I was struck by what they said about, young children need their moms, which may seem an obvious thing to say about mammals, but I find it interesting that for now, compared to where we were when this was written, young children don't have their moms at all. So it's interesting, I mean, in most, I mean, compared to this moment, compared to
Yeah.
the late 60s.
Mhm.
So to me, that's very interesting that there was kind of this almost foreshadowing saying, that women's, role in their families is to be protected.
Yeah.
But then it vanishes, right at that historical moment.
Let me
So,
offer you something else, okay? There's this 20 years after World War II, and the world is still under an intense threat from communism. And some of the initial or the very strong points was to tear parents away from their children, make them children of the state.
sure.
Or, and so I think maybe what it almost looks silly to us, but they were looking at it more from that direction, that children
Sure.
need fathers and mothers, or I mean, otherwise it's, but in that context of the times.
right, well, and I think foreshadowing, for example, during the 90s, we had the welfare to work debate, does it make sense for us to send single mothers raising children back to work if they are the only parent at home? And so, during that debate, I don't recall hearing voices saying, well, the church teaches that young children need their moms.
Yeah.
So we really can't do that until the children are at least 10 or 12, and I don't remember that being part of the conversation. It doesn't mean no one said it, but
Yeah.
it wasn't getting any airtime,
Yeah.
So it's interesting for me to hear that.
Well, you're seeing too, that's what, like what I mentioned, Benedict saying there's the council of media versus the actual real council. It's that, a number of these things, Gaudium et Spes said such and such. Did it actually say that? So, what was good? So, engaging modern society and culture. So there's a great desire. It wants to engage the things that it sees there. Benedict XVI, in that meeting with the clergy in Rome that I was mentioning, Benedict says that the great document, Gaudium et Spes, describes very well the problem analyzed between Christian eschatology, so that's our end in heaven, and worldly progress. So it goes through the problem between worldly progress and the true progress towards our heavenly end, between our responsibility for society of tomorrow and the responsibility of Christian before eternity. And it also renewed Christian ethics and a lot of the foundations like human dignity. So those are some of the very good things. it offers a Christian anthropology, so a Christian understanding of who man is, especially in those two that I emphasized, paragraphs 22 and 24, that Christ reveals man to man himself, and that we find ourselves through the sincere gift of self. And those really form a foundation of a lot of the things John Paul II said, especially his theology of the body. Really, it's giving the world an alternative view in all those areas: marriage and family, human progress, economics, politics. And it's had a great impact on Catholic social teaching. So Catholic social teaching is a group of some of these concepts that apply to many of the topics we've been talking about. This whole body of teachings started before the council itself, continued through the council, and continues today. One of Benedict's encyclicals, Caritas in Veritate, would be considered a social part of the Church's social teachings, a very social document. So those are a few of the good things. What was mistaken? Some people took the optimism of the document and understood it as just an uncritical acceptance of progressivism. So progressivism is basically saying whatever new that comes is better than what was old. So new is better just by the fact that it is here now, and old is always bad. But a true progress has to be oriented toward Christ. So isolating sections, like I said, like for example, in paragraph 36, there's a part where it says about a legitimate autonomy of the world, and so let's see. Some interpreted that to mean that the church really has no say in any of that. So it should just keep its nose out of what's going on in the world. Or misinterpretations of Gaudium 33, not always having at hand the solution to particular problems. That it's talking about the church not always having solutions to particular problems that come up within society and in politics. So then they interpreted that to mean, well, then bishops and priests should just remain quiet in areas that they don't have knowledge about, or in areas when it comes to politics. But there are areas that come into politics that we do have knowledge about. So that's the whole thing, being able to speak against, abortion and euthanasia, same-sex unions, the death penalty. So being able to speak about those things that come up in political life, we legitimately can, because we do have knowledge in those areas. So we can speak. Or a misunderstanding of paragraph 43, which invokes the laity's experience to deny church teaching. To say, well, our experience in the world tells us that you priests and bishops are out of touch with the modern world, and so therefore we don't need to accept these teachings of the church anymore. Well, it's not talking. It's talking about the laity's role in the church, but the laity's role has to be in union with God's law as well. So what remains to be done? So Gaudium et Spes was taken to be the document of the church that really opened the church's windows open to the world. And so many people like it because of that fact. Yes, the church is open to the modern world, but the thing that remains to continue to be done is to challenge the modern world to open their window to the world of transcendent love and truth. Because it's not a one-way thing. It's not that, the church opened itself up to the modern world, so now it's going to change to conform itself to the modern world. No, we opened ourselves to the modern world so that we can bring the eternal truth to the modern world in a way that transforms it to be really what the people in the modern world really, without even knowing it, strive to want to be. Kind of as a final thing here.
Unfortunately, the 16 landmark documents produced by the Second Vatican Council have been buried under a mass of publications which instead of making the council texts known, have often hidden them, Pope Benedict said today at his weekly general audience. The council's teachings need to be liberated from the deluge, he said, because they can still guide the Church today. Pope Benedict recalled that when Blessed John XXIII opened the council on October 11, 1962, he underlined the Council Fathers' true task, to speak to a rapidly changing world about the faith in a renewed and more incisive manner. However, Pope John emphasized that the Church's perennial truths were to remain intact, without any weakening or compromise, he said. The Church was to open up to the modern world, Pope Benedict said, not to conform to it, but to present our world, which tends to turn away from God, with the necessity of the gospel in all of its greatness and purity.
So it ends with his words. Next time, we will continue in this dialogue with the world, specifically in our relationship with other Christians. So that will be April 5th, so after Easter. Have a blessed rest of Lent, and see you then.